the most feared man in all of Seoul. A man whose name is never spoken above a whisper in the back rooms of Gangnam, in the port warehouses of Busan, in the offices of men who believe they are untouchable. A man who built an empire not with inheritance or luck, but with blood, silence, and the kind of patience that only comes from surviving things that should have killed you. Now imagine that same man, Kang Jihoon, 39 years old, broad-shouldered, be-tattooed from collar to wrist, sitting alone at a worn diner counter in Itaewon on a Thursday night. No bodyguards, no entourage, no gold-plated whiskey glass in a skyline penthouse. Just a man in a black suit hunched over a cheap tumbler like he is trying to drown something that simply refuses to die. He was not what you would expect. Not here, not like this. The tattoos climbed his neck above his collar and wrapped around his wrists below his cuffs. But everything else about him was controlled, still, watchful. The kind of stillness that does not come from peace, but from a man who has trained himself never to let anything show. Cold, dark eyes, a scar across his right knuckles, a gold watch on his wrist that cost more than most people earned in a year, worn the way a soldier wears a medal, not for pride, but because he forgot to take it off. He came to Bokdok Diner every Thursday night, not for the food, though the doenjang jjigae was honest and the rice was always warm. He came because this was the only place in Seoul where no one wanted anything from him, where the staff brought his drink, left in silence, and treated him the way they treated every other tired person who walked through the door, like a human being who simply needed somewhere to sit. He had been coming here for 2 years, and for 2 years he had noticed the woman behind the counter, and the one with silver-streaked hair pinned back and burn scars running up both forearms. The one who moved through her shift like water moving around stone. Quiet, persistent, unbothered by the noise and the heat and the hours that never seemed to end. She never asked the customers for anything beyond their order. She never complained. She simply worked, the way certain women work, as if rest were a luxury that belonged to someone else's life. He had never spoken to her beyond the usual exchange. She had never spoken to him beyond what was required. But tonight, this particular Thursday, on a night that looked like every other night, that woman would do something she had never done in her entire life. She would walk across the diner floor with shaking hands and eyes red from a grief she had been holding since before dawn. She would press her palms together in front of him, and in a voice that barely held itself together, she would say the words that would break open every wall Kang Jihoon had spent 20 years building around his chest. I know this is strange, and I know you don't know me, but my daughter worked for 3 years for one moment on a stage tomorrow, and she has no one to walk beside her. She doesn't need money. She doesn't need anything complicated. She just needs a father for today. What seemed, on the surface, or like a desperate and impossible request from a stranger would become the beginning of something no one predicted. Least of all, the man who had stopped believing he was capable of being anything more than what the streets had made him. Stay until the end to find out how one mother's courage and 6 quiet words broke the King of Seoul's underworld wide open and gave 3 broken people back something they had each stopped hoping they would ever find again. If this story moves you, I share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to how it all began. The whiskey was the same brand every week. Single malt, no ice, poured to the same level in the same glass by the same counter staff who had learned, through careful observation, exactly how much to say when they set it down in front of him. Nothing. The answer was nothing. Jihoon lifted the glass and let the burn settle at the back of his throat. And the way he always did on Thursday nights, he stopped fighting the memories. He let them come. It was the only place he allowed himself that. Here, in this corner booth, with the low hum of the diner around him and the smell of doenjang in the air, the memories did not feel like attacks. They felt almost like company. Cha Hayan had been 24 when they met. He was 26, and already too far gone into the Kang organization to pretend he was anything other than what he was. He had told her, on the third time they saw each other, exactly the kind of man he was. The territories he controlled, the things he had done to hold them, the likelihood that loving him would cost her something she could not afford to lose. She had looked at him for a long moment after he finished. Then she said, "That's the most dramatic way anyone has ever tried to scare me out of a second date." He had not been able to help himself. He laughed. The real kind, the kind that surprised him on the way out. He had not laughed like that since he was a boy. Hyan was the only person in his adult life who looked at him without calculation behind their eyes. No fear, no angling for position, no careful management of his moods to keep themselves safe. She simply looked at him the way you look at a person, directly without agenda, and said what she thought, which was frequently inconvenient and always exactly right. She called him stubborn with the affection of someone stating an obvious fact. She made him eat properly. She told him his second-in-command, Park Tae-seo, was clearly devoted to him and that Jihoon's habit of never acknowledging it was going to become a problem someday. She was right about everything. She always was. It was at this booth, this exact counter seat in Bokdaeok Diner, which she had chosen because the Sundubu Jjigae was, in her words, worth crossing the city for, that she told him she was pregnant. She had slid the test across the laminate counter toward him between the banchan dishes, casual as passing the soy sauce, and then watched his face with those bright, patient eyes of hers. He had stared at the test for a long time. Then he had looked up at her. "I don't know how to be a father," he said. "You didn't know how to run a criminal empire either," she said. You figured it out." That was the last, genuinely uncomplicated moment of happiness Jihoon could locate in the years that followed. He had reached for it many times since, tried to hold it still in his memory the way you press a flower between pages, and it had always held its shape. A test on a diner counter, her eyes, the particular quality of the light. The pregnancy ended at 7 months. A daughter, they had not named her yet, and had been arguing pleasantly about it for weeks, who arrived too early and too still and took something of Haeyeon with her when she left. The doctors called it grief-related decline. Jihoon called it what it was, a woman whose heart had simply decided it was done. 14 months after the hospital, Haeyeon was gone. He had never told anyone about the baby, not Tae-seo, not a single man in the entire Kang organization, which by then controlled construction contracts across Seoul and Busan, and 3 entertainment venue networks, import channels that moved more product through Incheon Port than any legitimate company twice its size, an empire that obeyed his voice absolutely. None of it had the power to give him back 1 minute of that evening at this counter. So he came back every Thursday, not chasing happiness, not torturing himself, simply refusing to forget. And tonight, the glass halfway down, on the diner thinning out around him, he noticed the woman behind the counter was still there, moving through the tail end of her shift the way she always did, quietly, without complaint, like someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the work never really ended. He had never learned her name. He was about to. Sunhee had not always been this quiet. There was a version of her before, a woman who laughed too loudly at her own jokes, and who danced in the kitchen while making breakfast, who once drove 4 hours to the coast on a Tuesday for no reason other than that Min-jae had said the sunrise over the East Sea was something a person should see at least once in their life. That woman had not disappeared entirely. She had simply gone somewhere deep inside, somewhere protected, to make room for everything that came after. She married Min-jae at 24. He was a bus driver on the Itaewon-Dongdaemun route, gentle, deliberate, and the kind of man who remembered small things, your coffee order, the name of your childhood dog, the song playing the first time you held hands. They were not rich. They were something better. Steady. She had Yuna at 28, and the three of them lived in a small apartment in Mapo-gu that was always slightly too warm in summer and slightly too cold in winter, and she had never once thought to want more than what she had. Then Min-jae died. He was a drunk driver on the Gangbyeon Expressway on a Tuesday afternoon. The kind of accident that ends in 30 seconds what took a decade to build. The driver was the third son of a construction company chairman. His family hired 4 attorneys. The case was reduced, delayed, and ultimately settled for an amount that did not cover the funeral costs under conditions that required her silence. The judge cited mitigating circumstances. And Sunhee had sat in that courtroom with 4-year-old Yuna asleep across her lap and understood, for the first time in her life, exactly how the world was organized and where she stood within it. She never spoke of it again. She simply worked. Bokdik Diner hired her 9 years ago when Yuna started school, and Sunhee needed hours that would let her be home by evening. The owner was not unkind. The work was not gentle. Early mornings and late nights, a grease and steam, and the particular exhaustion of being on your feet for 12 hours while maintaining the expression of someone who is fine. The burn scars on her forearms came from a kitchen fire in her 3rd year, a gas valve that failed, a flash of heat that was over in seconds and left its mark permanently. The owner expressed sympathy. There was no compensation. Sunhee wrapped the wounds herself, came back the following week, and said nothing about it to anyone. She only worked. That was what she knew how to do. Yuna was 13 years old and had her father's eyes and her mother's spine, and the particular combination produced something that stopped people mid-sentence when they encountered it. She was not loud about her intelligence. She simply applied it the way her mother applied labor, steadily, without drama, without waiting to be acknowledged. She studied by the light of her phone when the electricity bill ran late. And she tutored 2 classmates in mathematics for a small fee and quietly folded the money into the envelope on the kitchen counter where Sunhee kept the household cash. She had never, not once in her memory, asked her mother for anything beyond what was absolutely necessary because she had understood from a young age, the way children of hardship always understand too early, exactly what things cost and who was paying. 3 months ago, a letter arrived from the Hanguk Young Scholars Foundation. Yuna had been selected. Out of 2,000 applicants nationwide, 40 students. The ceremony would be held at the Grand Hyatt Seoul. Each recipient would walk the stage to receive their medal accompanied by a family escort. Sunhee read the letter in the bathroom with the door locked and cried for 20 minutes. Then she washed her face, came out smiling, and told Yuna she was proud of her. The ceremony was in 3 days, then 2, then 1. Yuna said nothing about the escort. Not a word. Sunhee told herself her daughter wasn't bothered, that a medal was enough, that they were enough, the 2 of them, the way they had always been enough. Then, the night before, Sunhee passed Yuna's door and heard her daughter's voice, soft, careful, the voice she used when she thought no one was listening, speaking to the framed photograph of Min-jae on the shelf. "Appa, I know you can't come. I know that." A pause. "I just need you for 1 day." Today." Sunhee pressed her back against the hallway wall. She did not make a sound. She stood there in the dark for a long time after Yuna went quiet. The next morning she arrived at Bokdik Diner with red eyes and steady hands, the way she arrived at every hard morning, composed on the outside, carrying everything on the inside. She tied her apron. She started the coffee. She moved through the early rush the way she always did, efficiently, without complaint. And then, Somewhere between the breakfast orders and the mid-morning lull, she looked up and saw the man at the corner counter, the one with the tattoos and the gold watch and the untouched whiskey, the one who always said thank you like he meant it, the one whose eyes, whenever he stared into his glass, looked exactly like Yuna's eyes in the dark, like someone grieving something they had long stopped believing they could get back. Sunhee stood very still behind the counter, and something shifted inside her that she could not explain and did not have time to question. She almost didn't do it. That is the part no one would ever know. How many times in the 40 minutes between seeing him at the counter and finally moving toward him, Sunhee talked herself out of it. She told herself it was absurd. She told herself a man like that did not want to be disturbed. She told herself she did not even know his name. That 2 years of refilled whiskey glasses and generous tips did not constitute a relationship, that whatever she thought she had seen in his eyes was probably only her own exhaustion reflected back at her. She told herself all of this while her hands moved automatically through the lunch rush, clearing plates, wiping surfaces, answering questions she couldn't remember being asked. The diner thinned out the way it always did after 2 o'clock, the noise dropping to a low murmur, so the afternoon settling into the particular stillness that came before the dinner crowd. He was still there. He was always still there. What do you actually know about him? She asked herself one last time, standing at the end of the counter with a damp cloth in her hands. She knew he came every Thursday. She knew he tipped more than the bill without making anything of it. She knew he said thank you the way people say it when they were taught that gratitude is owed, not performed, quietly, directly like a man settling a debt. She knew his eyes in unguarded moments held the specific heaviness of someone who had learned to carry grief by refusing to put it down. That was all she knew. It was enough. She untied her apron, folded it over the counter, and walked across the diner floor. It was the longest walk of her life, longer than the walk into the courtroom the day the judge let the man who killed Minjae go home to his family, longer than the walk back from the hospital the night the doctors told her there was nothing more they could do. Her hands came together in front of her chest as she moved, the natural gesture, the one that meant I am asking, not demanding, and I know the difference, and she could feel her own pulse in her fingertips. He heard her footsteps and looked up before she reached the table. Their eyes met. And for the first time in 2 years of serving him coffee and whiskey and doenjang jjigae, she was not his waitress and he was not her customer. They were simply 2 people looking directly at each other, and neither of them looked away. She stopped at the edge of his table. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said. Her voice was steady. She had decided it would be steady. "I know this is not appropriate. You can tell me to leave, and I will understand." He said nothing. He only waited, in that particular way of his, completely still, completely present, the glass set aside. So she told him, not all at once. She started with the ceremony, explaining it carefully, the foundation, the 40 students, the Grand Hyatt. Her voice held through that part. Then she told him about Yuna, 13 years old, her father's eyes, 3 years of work for one moment on a stage, and her voice thinned slightly but did not break. Then she told him what she had heard through the door the night before, her daughter's voice in the dark. "Appa, I just need you for one day." Now her voice broke there. She had known it would. She pressed through it anyway because she had not come this far to stop. "She doesn't need money," Sunhee said. "She doesn't need anything complicated." She looked at him directly, the way her daughter had taught her without meaning to. Chin level, nothing hidden. "She just needs a father for today." The silence that followed was the longest Sunhee had ever stood inside. Jihoon did not move. His face gave her nothing. The walls behind his eyes were so high and so old she could not see past them, and she felt the hope she had carried across the diner floor begin to dissolve quietly, the way it always did when you ask the world for something, and the world simply looked back at you. She began to straighten, to step back. Inside his chest, something was happening that Jihoon had no framework for. The walls had risen the moment she started speaking. Automatic, practiced. The architecture of 20 years of survival. His mind had run the calculation immediately. Unknown woman, unknown motive, exposure risk. The 1,000 reasons a man in his position did not involve himself in strangers' lives. And then she said what she had heard through the door, and the walls found something on the other side of them they had not expected to find. Hayon, the corner booth, the test sliding across the laminate counter between the banchan dishes. Her eyes, patient, bright, looking at him like he was capable of being something the streets had never asked him to be. I don't know how to be a father. You didn't know how to run a criminal empire either. You figured it out. He looked at the woman standing in front of him. Burn scars on her forearms, silver in her hair, eyes that had clearly been red since morning and were red still, held steady by nothing but the force of a will that had been carrying more than its share for a very long time. She was already pulling back. "What time does it start?" he said. Sunhee went completely still. She stared at him for one full second, as if the words had arrived in a language she needed a moment to translate, as if she had prepared herself so thoroughly for the answer being no that yes had no place to land. Then the tears came, fast, silent, the kind that do not ask permission. She bowed, deeply, her silver-streaked hair falling forward across her face, now her hands still pressed together. And the thank you that came out of her was not the polite, reflexive kind she gave 100 times a shift. It was the other kind, the kind that comes from somewhere below words, from the place where a person keeps the things they have stopped asking for because asking and not receiving had become more than they could bear. "Thank you," she said again, barely sound at all. "I thank you. Now, before we go any further, if this story is reaching something in you, this is the moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what Jihoon discovered that night, when he went home and quietly ran a background check on a diner waitress and her dead husband, will change everything you think you understand about why he was really sitting at that counter. Some coincidences are not coincidences. Some debts take 20 years to find their way home. Yeah, what happens next is where the past comes back, and it will not come quietly. He told himself it was caution. That was the word he used, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Han River penthouse with his phone already in his hand. Standard operational caution. A woman he did not know had approached him in a public place and made a personal request. Protocol required verification. It was simply what you did. Young Woo-sik answered on the second ring, the way he always did, regardless of the hour. "Oh, Sunhee," Jihoon said. "Works at Bokdeok Diner in Itaewon, and her late husband. Oh, Min-jae, everything you can find. I need it before morning." Woo-sik asked no questions. He never did. That was why Jihoon trusted him. Jihoon set the phone down and looked out at the city. Seoul at midnight was a different animal from Seoul in daylight, quieter on the surface, but underneath it, all the same machinery running, all the same calculations being made, and all the same people trying to hold on to what they had built with insufficient materials and insufficient time. He knew that world better than he knew anything else. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey he did not drink and waited. The files arrived at 1 a.m. He opened Sunhee's file first. What he read confirmed what he already knew in outline: the husband's death, the years at the diner, the daughter, but one line in the property section made him stop. Business location: Bokdeok Diner. To 14 Itaewon Row. Building owner: KH Property Holdings, subsidiary of Kang Industries. He read it twice. KH Property Holdings had acquired that block 7 years ago as part of a larger commercial deal. 12 buildings in 3 districts, purchased in a single transaction that Jihoon had approved in under 10 minutes because the numbers were clean and the location was strategically useful. He had never walked those streets, had never known the individual tenants, but he remembered the rent policy. It had been Haeyeon's idea, or rather Haeyeon's observation, delivered over dinner one evening with the particular directness she reserved for things she considered obvious. The city is eating its own working people alive. The rents in those neighborhoods have tripled in 8 years. Every small business that closes is a family that disappears. She had not asked him to do anything. She rarely asked directly, and she simply stated the truth and trusted him to respond to it. He had quietly instructed Woosik to cap commercial rents across that block at 2019 rates indefinitely with no public attribution. He had not thought about it since. For 7 years, without ever knowing her name, he had been keeping the roof over Sunhee's livelihood. Haeyeon's instruction carried forward, a policy applied to a spreadsheet line, protecting a woman he had served whiskey to every Thursday for 2 years without understanding the connection. He closed that file and opened the second one. Oh Min-jae, bus driver, Route 49, Itaewon to Dongdaemun, 11 years of service, clean record, killed on the Gangbyeon Expressway 9 years ago, survived by a wife and 1 daughter, and then, near the bottom of the file, a cross-reference, an incident report, 20 years old. I flagged in the system because the names overlapped with a separate investigation. Route 49, late service. Driver Oh Min-jae intervened in an assault involving 4 assailants and 1 passenger. Assailants forcibly removed from vehicle. Driver sustained minor injuries. Passenger identity not recorded. Jihoon did not move for a long time. He did not need the passenger's name recorded. He knew whose name it was. He had been 19 years old. 4 of the SEO clan's junior enforcers had been waiting for him at the back of a late-night bus. A message from Seo Byung-hak's father, who had wanted to make clear to the youngest Kang in the organization that he was not yet untouchable. They had cornered him in the rear seats, and the situation had been moving in only one direction when the driver appeared at the top of the aisle with a fire extinguisher in both hands and a look on his face of absolute, unhurried conviction. Not on my bus. For 3 words, delivered without drama, without any apparent awareness of who the 4 men were or what refusing them might cost. The enforcers had looked at the driver, then at each other, and left. Jihoon never fully understood why. Perhaps they simply had not been prepared for the interruption. Perhaps there was something in the driver's stillness that complicated their arithmetic. Jihoon had sent money to the bus depot the following week. Anonymous, in cash, more than a year's salary. And he was told 3 days later that the driver had sent it back. He had thought about that occasionally over the years, the kind of man who sends the money back. Now he sat in the dark of his penthouse with the file open on the screen in front of him and understood for the first time that the debt he had carried for 20 years had not dissolved with time. It had only been waiting for the correct form of repayment to present itself. Not money. Min-jae had already refused money, not power. See, that was not the currency the Oh family dealt in. Tomorrow morning, Jihoon would put on a suit and drive to a small apartment in Mapo-gu and stand beside a 13-year-old girl on the most important day of her young life. It was the only thing worth offering. And it was, somehow, exactly enough. He closed the laptop, looked out at the river. For the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, he did not feel like a man sitting alone at the edge of something. He felt strangely, like a man with somewhere to be. He stood in front of the mirror for longer than he usually did. The suit was dark navy, not black, a distinction that mattered for reasons he could not have fully articulated. Black was for business. Black was the Kang organization, the meetings, the weight of what he was. Navy was something else, something closer to ordinary. He buttoned the collar high and checked the result. The tattoos at his neck disappeared beneath the fabric. How he buttoned the cuffs to the wrist, the ones climbing his forearms gone. What remained in the mirror was a large, serious man in a well-cut suit who could have been, from a certain angle, almost unremarkable. Almost. Park Tae-seo was leaning in the doorway when Jihoon turned around. His second-in-command was 41 years old, lean and watchful, a man whose expressions operated on a frequency most people could not detect. Right now he was wearing the one that meant he had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "There's a problem," Tae-seo said. Jihoon waited. "Seo Byung-hak knows you're going to the Grand Hyatt this afternoon. Civilian venue, public event, no visible security." A pause. "He's moving people into position." The SEO clan. Of course. Byung-hak had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening for 2 years, a moment when Jihoon was somewhere he could not respond without consequences, and surrounded by people who had nothing to do with any of it. "How many?" 3 confirmed, possibly more. Tae-seo straightened slightly. "I'm recommending we cancel, reschedule. We can find another way to—" "No." The word came out quietly, but it landed with the particular finality that Tae-seo knew better than to argue past. He closed his mouth. Jihoon straightened his cuffs. "Position our people at every exit. Service entrances, parking structure, loading dock. I want them invisible. No earpieces visible, no clustering, nothing that reaches that ceremony hall." He looked at Tae-seo directly. "If Byung-hak's men move, you handle it below. Clean and quiet. The people inside that room do not find out there was ever anything to find out. And if something gets through, then it reaches me first." He said it the way he said most things, without drama, as simple statement of fact. "Understood?" Tae-seo held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, turned, and then left without another word. The apartment building in Mapo-gu was the kind that did not apologize for what it was. Functional, aging, the exterior patched in 2 places where the render had cracked. Jihoon parked the plain black car at the curb, no driver, and walked to the intercom alone. The street was quiet in the late morning. A woman hung laundry on a 3rd-floor balcony. A child on a bicycle navigated the uneven pavement with great concentration. But he pressed the buzzer for apartment 4B. A pause. Then Sunhee's voice, slightly breathless. Yes, I'll be right down." He waited on the front step. The door opened and Sunhee appeared first. She looked entirely different from the woman behind the counter. Or rather, she looked like the same woman with the diner stripped away, which turned out to be its own kind of revelation. She was wearing a navy hanbok blouse with dark trousers. Her silver-streaked hair pinned back with more care than usual, her posture carrying the particular dignity of someone who has dressed for an occasion they intend to honor fully. She looked nervous and composed simultaneously, the way people look when they are holding something precious and trying not to show how afraid they are of dropping it. "Mr. Kang," she said, "thank you for—" She stopped, because Yuna had appeared in the doorway behind her, 13 years old. Her father's wide and warm eyes and her mother's spine and an expression on her face that belonged to someone considerably older, the direct level gaze of a person who had done their reading and arrived at their own conclusions. She was in her school uniform, her medal ceremony ribbon already pinned to her collar, her school bag over one shoulder. She looked at Jihoon for a long, unhurried moment. Then she said quietly and without preamble, "I know who you are, mister." "A Kang." The air on the landing went completely still. Sunhee's face drained. Jihoon watched her reach for her daughter's arm, already forming words. An apology, a correction, something to manage the damage. But Yuna was not finished. My father always said the measure of a man is what he does when nobody is forcing him. Her voice was steady, not defiant, simply sure. You didn't have to come. You don't owe us anything. A brief pause. So I'm glad you did. She bowed, formally, correctly, and the full degree, straightened, turned, and picked up her school bag from just inside the door. We should go, she said, practically. We don't want to be late. She walked past both of them toward the car. Jihoon stood in the doorway of the small Mapo apartment and did not move for a moment. Sunhee was looking at him with an expression caught somewhere between mortification and something else she hadn't yet named. He was not looking at Sunhee, and he was watching the 13-year-old girl walk calmly toward his car with her school bag over her shoulder and her ribbon pinned straight, and he was feeling something shift behind his ribs, something that had no name in any language he had ever used, in any room he had ever stood in any version of himself he had ever been required to be. He had been called many things in his life, most of them accurate. Nobody had ever been glad he came. The Grand Hyatt Seoul had dressed itself for the occasion. The ballroom had been arranged with the particular formality of events that understood their own significance. 40 rows of seats in precise lines, each chair occupied by families who had traveled from every corner of the country for this afternoon. A stage at the front with a long red runner extending from its base into the audience, flanked by tall arrangements of white chrysanthemums. Spotlights positioned to fall on exactly one person at a time. Officials in dark, formal dress moving with the measured care of people who knew they were custodians of something that mattered. It was the kind of room, Jihoon thought as they were shown to their seats, that made honest hardship feel simultaneously proud and acutely aware of itself. The families around them wore their best. You could tell, if you knew how to look, and which best had been bought recently, and which had been preserved carefully for years against exactly this kind of day. Sunhee had preserved hers for years. He could tell. He took his seat and registered immediately that there were 3 chairs in their row. Sunhee on his left, an empty chair on his right. He said nothing. He did not ask. He understood without being told the set of Sunhee's shoulders when she glanced at it, the way she straightened slightly and then looked forward, as if she had made a decision about her posture, that this was not an oversight. He shifted his weight slightly in his seat, toward the empty chair. A small adjustment, barely visible. He could not have explained it if asked. He did not look at it again. The ceremony began at 2 o'clock precisely. 39 names before hers. 39 children walking the red runner while their families rose and photographed and wept and applauded, and the accumulated emotion in the room building gradually the way pressure builds, looking for somewhere to go. Jihoon sat through all of it with his hands resting on his knees, his face composed, watching each child with the same attention he gave everything, complete, impersonal, missing nothing. Then the official at the podium spoke the 40th name. Oh, Yuna. The applause that greeted it was polite, as it had been for every name. But Sunhee beside him made a sound she immediately suppressed. Not quite a word, just a breath with a shape to it, and then pressed her hand over her mouth and did not lower it again. Jihoon watched Yuna emerge from the side of the stage. She walked the way she had walked to his car that morning, without hurry, without performance, with the level chin and the still hands of someone who had decided exactly how this moment would go and was simply executing that decision. And her uniform was pressed, her ribbon sat straight. Her school bag was gone, replaced by the quiet authority of a girl who understood that right now she was representing something larger than herself and intended to do it properly. The red runner was long. She covered it slowly in silence, and every step was its own small declaration. Her lower lip trembled once, faintly, about halfway down. She did not let it become anything more. She was 13 years old, and she walked like someone who had been practicing dignity her entire life. Not because anyone taught her, but because no one had given it to her, and she had decided to construct it herself, piece by piece, from whatever materials were available. Jihoon had seen men walk to difficult things with less composure. She reached the podium, accepted the medal from the foundation chairman with both hands and a formal bow, straightened, and turned to face the audience. And she found her mother first. Sunhee was already crying, silently, completely. One hand still pressed to her mouth, the tears moving in steady lines down her face with no apparent intention of stopping. Yuna looked at her for a long moment with an expression of such unguarded love that several people in the surrounding rows who had no connection to either of them quietly looked away, as if they had accidentally seen something too private to witness. Then Yuna's eyes moved. They found Jihoon. Nay, she held his gaze with that same quality he had noticed in the doorway that morning, the direct, unhurried look of a person who had thought carefully about what she was seeing and arrived somewhere beyond surprise. Not gratitude exactly, not the shining wonder of a child receiving a gift, something older than that, something that looked in a way he was not prepared for, like recognition, like she was looking at a man who knew, the way she knew, and the way her mother knew, what it meant to carry something too heavy for too long without being able to set it down. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Jihoon looked away. The muscle along his jaw tightened once, hard, and held. He fixed his eyes on the middle distance, a point somewhere above the stage, below the lights belonging to nothing, and breathed slowly through his nose, the way he had trained himself to breathe through things for 20 years. He did not move. His face gave the room nothing, but his right hand, resting on his knee, was not entirely steady. The tremor was small, almost nothing. The kind of thing only someone sitting directly beside him, paying close attention, would have any chance of seeing. Sunhee saw it. She did not say anything. She did not look at him or draw attention to it in any way. She simply reached over, without comment. Aiken placed her hand over his for a moment. The brief, matter-of-fact gesture of someone steadying a person who is trying very hard not to need steadying, and then withdrew it. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It moved through 6 years of carefully constructed numbness, the way a single crack moves through ice. Not shattering it, not dramatic, just quietly and permanently changing the structure of the thing. Jihoon kept his eyes forward. On stage, Yuna was walking back to her seat with her medal in both hands and her chin still level. Around them, the applause continued. The official at the podium moved on to closing remarks. The afternoon light came through the high windows at a low angle, falling across 40 rows of families in their best clothes, all of them having traveled here from different kinds of hardship to watch their children be honored. Jihoon sat in the middle of all of it and felt, and somewhere beneath the ice and the architecture of 2 decades of deliberate isolation, something he had last felt at a diner counter with a pregnancy test between the banchan dishes. The dangerous, specific warmth of having somewhere to be, of belonging, however briefly and improbably, to something worth protecting. The applause was still fading when his phone vibrated, a single pulse against his ribs, the pattern he and Taeseo had agreed on for urgent, silent communication. And he kept his face exactly as it was, and slid the phone from his inner pocket with the practiced ease of a man checking the time, angling the screen so only he could read it. 3 SEO men. Service entrance B. We have them. Wait for my signal. He pocketed the phone in the same motion and returned his attention to the room. Around them, 40 families were beginning the slow, cheerful process of gathering coats and bags and children, and the ballroom filling with the particular noise of an occasion successfully concluded. Laughter, the scrape of chairs, parents calling to each other across rows. Normal, warm, entirely unaware. Yuna was 3 seats away, already moving to stand. "Yuna ya," Jihoon said, and the name came out naturally without him planning it. She looked at him with mild surprise. It was the first time he had used her name without the formal address. Some of the other scholars are still taking photos near the stage. You should go. You've earned the right to be in those pictures." She considered this for a moment, then nodded and turned back toward the stage without argument, the way practical people respond to practical suggestions. Sunhee was gathering her bag from under her chair. Jihoon turned to her. "The blouse," he said. "The one you're wearing. My wife had something similar. I should have said earlier. It suits you." Sunhee paused. Clearly not expecting this. A faint color came into her face. "Thank you. It's old. I've had it for—" "It's well chosen," he said simply. "Take your time tonight. There's no hurry." She looked at him for just a moment too long. Sunhee-oh had spent 9 years reading the small shifts in a room the way sailors read weather, the customer whose patience was ending, the kitchen running behind, the small signals that told her what was coming before it arrived. It was not instinct exactly, and it was the accumulated attention of a woman who had learned early that the price of being caught off guard was higher than she could afford. She was reading him now. He could feel it. He met her eyes with a calm that was entirely deliberate and entirely constructed, and offered her nothing behind it to work with. "Take your time," he said again, quietly. "Tonight is worth remembering slowly." Whatever she saw in his face, or didn't see, she accepted it. And she turned toward the stage where Yuna was being introduced to another scholar by an enthusiastic set of parents from Busan. Jihoon watched. Yuna shook the other scholar's hand with both of hers, formally, and said something that made the girl smile. Then she asked the girl's name, used it immediately in her next sentence, and listened to the answer with her full attention. She worked through 4 separate introductions in 6 minutes, each one complete, each one genuinely meant. Haminjae's daughter, Jihoon thought, no question. The man on the late-night bus with a fire extinguisher and 3 words had raised this, had built this, had left this behind in the world before the Gangbyeon Expressway took him. This 13-year-old girl who thanked people by name and meant it and walked red runners like she had always belonged on them. The phone vibrated again. He read it without taking it fully from his pocket. Clear. All 3 neutralized. Parking structure. Clean. Jihoon exhaled once. Controlled, quiet, through his nose. He put the phone away. He looked up at the chandeliers, then across the emptying ballroom, then at nothing in particular for a moment. Then he stood and said, "I think we're ready." And that was all. The night air outside the Grand Hyatt met them at the top of the entrance steps, cool and clean, carrying the particular clarity of a Seoul autumn evening, the kind that made the city below look like something worth having. The lights of Namsan stretched across the middle distance, the Han River a dark ribbon beyond it, and all of it glittering with the uncomplicated beauty of a place that did not know or care what had just been handled 40 meters beneath their feet. Yuna stopped on the top step and held her medal up in the yellow glow of the entrance lights, examining it the way she examined most things, carefully, with her full attention, as if it deserved to be looked at properly. Sunhee already had her phone out. She took the photograph. Yuna with her medal and the city behind her and the particular expression of someone who has worked for something long enough that receiving it feels less like celebration than like confirmation. Yes, this is what I thought it would be. This is real. This is mine. Then Sunhee lowered the phone, looked at Yuna, looked at Jihoon. She didn't ask. She simply turned the phone toward them both, the question entirely in the gesture. Jihoon looked at the phone, then at Yuna. Yuna tilted her chin at him, a small, decisive movement. "Come on." He stepped beside her. He was not sure what to do with his hands. He settled them at his sides and looked at the phone with the expression of a man executing an unfamiliar task with full commitment to doing it correctly. Sunhee took the photograph. Jihoon did not smile. He was not a man who smiled for cameras or for much else, and manufacturing one now would have produced something worse than its absence. But he did not look away. He stood beside the 13-year-old girl in the yellow light of the hotel entrance with the city spread out behind them, and his posture, the set of his shoulders, the angle of his body, the precise and unconscious way he had positioned himself between her and the open night, was unmistakably, instinctively protective, like someone standing guard over something that mattered. Like someone who had, somewhere between a diner counter and a red runner and a two-word message on a stage, started to understand what that word meant again. They walked back to the car in the cool night air, Yuna 3 steps ahead the way she had been all evening, not distancing herself, just moving at the pace of someone whose thoughts were already ranging forward, while the adults behind her were still processing where they stood. Sunhee waited until they were away from the hotel entrance, and away from the last of the departing families before she asked, "Who are you, really?" Not loud, not accusatory, simply the question she had been carrying since the ceremony ended, stated in the direct, quiet way she stated most things, because she had learned long ago that dressing a question up did not make the answer easier to hear. Jihoon walked 2 more steps before he answered. He considered the easier version, the one that was technically sufficient. Businessman, property holdings, as someone who owed a debt and paid it. Nothing more to discuss. It would have been entirely believable. She had no reason to press further. He discarded it. "I'm not a good man," he said. "By most measures." He kept his eyes on the street ahead. "I run an organization that operates in ways that don't survive scrutiny. I have made decisions that I cannot undo and have not tried to. That is what I am." Sunhee said nothing. She was listening the way she listened to everything, completely, and without interrupting, giving it the space it required. "The chair," he said, "the empty one you kept." He felt her go still beside him without breaking stride. "The man who should have been sitting in it, your husband, did something for me once, 20 years ago, on a late-night bus on the Itaewon route." A pause. "He stood between me and 4 men who intended to do serious damage, and he used a fire extinguisher and 3 words, and then he refused the money I sent afterward. He said it flatly, without embellishment, the way you state a debt you have been carrying long enough that the shape of it is simply part of you. I never found a way to repay it. Until today." The silence that followed was long enough that he glanced at her. Sunhee was looking straight ahead, her expression doing something complicated and controlled, her hands loose at her sides. He watched her absorb it, the full weight of it, the 20 years of it, the particular shape of the universe that had arranged all of this from a bus route and a fire extinguisher and a refused envelope of cash. Then very quietly, she said, "Min-jae would have found that funny." A breath, almost a sound. "That it took this long, that it came around like this." 3 steps ahead, Yuna's pace did not change, her head did not turn. She was giving every external indication of a person absorbed in her own thoughts, navigating the pavement, and entirely uninvolved in the conversation behind her. She was absolutely listening. Every word. Jihoon reached into his inner pocket and produced a plain card. No name, no title, only a number printed in small, clean type, and held it out to Sunhee without ceremony. "If you ever need anything," he said, "either of you, anything at all." Sunhee took it, looked at it for a moment, folded it carefully and placed it in her coat pocket with the particular deliberateness of someone who intended to keep it. At the car, Yuna stopped and turned, her school bag over one shoulder, her medal catching the street light. She looked at him with her father's eyes and her mother's composure, and waited, the way she always waited, patiently, without demanding, giving the moment the room it needed. Jihoon did something he had not done once in the entire evening. He crouched down and brought himself to her eye level, fully, deliberately, the large man in the navy suit folding himself down to meet a 13-year-old girl where she stood rather than expecting her to keep looking up. "Your father was a brave man," he said, quietly, directly. "The bravest kind, the kind that doesn't think of themselves as brave at all." Yuna looked at him. Her chin wobbled once, just once. She pressed her lips together and held it, the way her mother held things, by deciding that she would. And then she nodded. A single, slow nod that carried everything she did not have words for yet. Jihoon straightened. He nodded once to Sunhee. Not a bow, not a farewell with any performance in it, simply the nod of a man acknowledging something real, and got into the car. He did not look back as he drove away. 6 months passed. Quietly, without announcement, without any single moment that could be identified afterward as the turning point, the Kang Jihoon began transferring the operational elements of the Kang organization's illegal holdings to a lieutenant he trusted with the work and did not trust with anything else. Construction contracts, import channels, the network of arrangements that had kept the organization fed for 20 years, handed over methodically in pieces. His attention moved instead to the legitimate holdings, the property portfolio, but the development projects that had always been the cleaner architecture beneath the darker one. He told no one why. He made no speech. He filed no declaration. Park Taeseo noticed within the first 3 weeks. He said nothing, asked nothing, simply adjusted his own work accordingly, the way he had always served Jihoon, by understanding what was needed before being told. If he had an opinion about what was happening, or why, and he kept it in the same place he kept everything else, entirely to himself. On a Thursday evening in late spring, Jihoon drove to Itaewon and parked at the curb in front of a building he had owned for 7 years, without knowing who worked inside it. He pushed open the door of Bokdeok Diner, the smell of doenjang and warm rice, the low hum of the early dinner crowd, the same counter, the same stools, the same low light above the pass-through window to the kitchen. And Sunhee looked up from the counter. Their eyes met the way they met now, without the distance of server and customer, without the loaded weight of the night at the Grand Hyatt, without anything needing to be established or explained. Simply the particular ease of two people who had seen each other clearly, in difficult light, and had not flinched at what they found. She reached for the bottle without being asked. He sat down. So from the corner booth, the one where Hae-on had slid a pregnancy test between the banchan dishes on a night that still lived in him like a pressed flower between pages, came the quiet sound of a pencil on paper. Yuna was at the corner table with her textbook spread around her and her school bag hanging from the chair back, the Hanguk Young Scholars Medal still clipped to the outer pocket where it had been since the night of the ceremony, and where, apparently, it intended to remain. She did not look up. She was deep in something. Mathematics, from the look of the open page. And her concentration had the absolute quality of someone who did not share it lightly. But when Jihoon settled onto the counter stool, something happened. Without looking up, without breaking the movement of her pencil, Yuna shifted her textbook 3 inches to the left on the table, making room. As if she had known he was coming. As if this were already somehow, simply how Thursday evenings went. Jihoon looked at the counter, looked out at the street where Seoul was doing what it always did, moving, lit, indifferent, magnificent. He picked up his glass, and for the first time on a Thursday night in 6 years, he did not feel like a man attending his own grief. He felt quietly and without drama and without any guarantee of what came next. like a man who had somewhere to be. Sometimes it does not take a grand gesture to pull a man back from the dark. Sometimes it only takes a 13-year-old girl who refuses to stop believing in the measure of a man, and a mother brave enough to walk across a diner floor on shaking legs and ask a stranger for one ordinary miracle. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you'll be here for the next one. And if you've ever been the person who asked for help when every instinct told you not to, or the person who showed up when no one was forcing you to, leave a comment below. Those are the stories worth telling. We read every single one.